Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the Construction Hall of Fame podcast. Today, we have a guest that I am super excited to have on the show. His name is Jason Dries-Daffner, and he's the current Chief Operating Officer for MBH Architects. So, Jason, pumped to have you on the show. Thank you for coming today.
Good morning, Matt. Thanks for having me. I really like what you're doing, both with Big League Talent and the Construction Hall of Fame podcast. So thanks for having me.
Much appreciated. The kind words definitely mean a lot. So, I want people to learn more about you and how you've essentially got to where you are today. So can we kick this show off by you just giving a little insight about how you got to where you are in your career?
Sure. I am Chief Operating Officer of MBH Architects. It's a firm headquartered in San Francisco Bay Area, though we have offices in Denver and New York, Mumbai and Bangalore, India. I've been practicing a little bit more than 26 years full-time after graduating. And I don't know if the path to this job was straightforward. I'm an architect by training and by discipline. I'm licensed in the state of California. My first job, I was an intern at a really great firm, Trachtenberg Architects in Berkeley, California. And, I was laying out title blocks and taking out the trash. And it was a great education. Lessons I learned from David Trachtenberg, who's the founder, resonate with me today, a couple decades later. In the ensuing 26 years, I worked at a number of different firms. My wife and I lived overseas for a little while, and I was able to work overseas, which is a great experience because you get to compare and contrast things that you take for granted. And over time, while all architecture is about design, each of us tends to develop a little bit of specialization, and I started doing more and more management, project management, and then management of multiple projects, and then management of studios, and that naturally leads into operations, which is how the practice itself runs, which is more than, let's say, the projects themselves. So it's just a slightly different take on the practice of architecture.
Definitely. Yeah, it's so interesting when I talk to leaders. I hear oftentimes they weren't 100% sure that they were going to end up where they ended up. They tried something, they had a great mentor, they learned a couple things along the way, they end up taking on more responsibility, they succeeded, they thrived in the challenge, and they just continued to step up. It sounds like your path, like you said, wasn't certain, but you definitely stepped up to challenges along the way. You took an approach of learning from mentors and not just getting something from the situation, but being able to bring value and actually help the team. And it sounds like that definitely paid off.
I think so. It's funny, you talked about, succeeded and learned along the way. For me, at least, it's the things I learned the most from. It's the failures and learned along the way. It's actually the lessons that resonate the most are where I have stumbled. Super humbling, really uncomfortable at the time, but for me, that's actually where I've probably grown the most, is messing things up.
100%. And actually, it's funny for me. In my head, it's almost like I don't consider things a loss if I finish them and I push through. Like, for example, if I'm given a new challenging task and it's hard in the beginning and I'm stumbling and I'm not catching it, but I'm willing to push through and just believe in my ability to figure it out and then to get the job done. That's something I found, like you said, that teaches me. And not only if I find it builds character and it shows me that I'm willing to push to get the thing done that's not easy, but I also learned so much from the stumbling along the way. I just refer to it as stumbling. Some people call it like failure or, however you want to refer to it. I guess I just refer to it in a different way. But I totally agree. Coming from sports even, I didn't learn the most from my best games. I learned the most from the games that were challenging, where I had a situation I hadn't faced before and I needed to practice for. So totally understand that.
Yeah, and probably where you felt that challenge, where you felt like you stumbled, that's also what you remember the most, right? It doesn't mean it's comfortable, doesn't mean it feels good, but at least for me, I remember the times that I stumbled, and that's I think where a lot of the growth comes from.
100%. Yeah. And it sticks with me and as like a feeling of, it's almost like a sting, but it's a sting in a good way because it's a sting that inspired growth. I found that almost all things that have come that are great in my life are on the other side of some challenge or some hurdle or something that was, tough to face. So that makes a lot of sense. And kind of to segue, you actually just recently, within the last month or so, joined MBH as their COO. What inspired that move?
Well, a couple of things. First, it's been about 3 months. I think we started this conversation, it had been about a month. The move, MBH inspired the move, to tell you the truth. I was working at a great firm with some great people, very challenging, fulfilling work. I wasn't necessarily looking for new opportunities, but it's a small industry, the architecture, engineering, construction, AEC industry. And I got a call from a representative of the firm saying, we have this opening. The firm has developed to the point where we'd like to bring on a chief operating officer, someone to manage operations. And would you be interested? And I said, well, I'd be interested in learning more and having a conversation. And I'm not particularly looking, but maybe I can refer someone. And we just chatted, and I said, tell me a little bit about what you're looking for. What are the skill sets? Where's the firm going? Where's the firm been recently? I knew about MBH. I've been practicing in the Bay Area most of my career, and they're a pretty amazing homegrown firm, founded in 1989. So I was certainly aware of them from the outside. I just didn't have any information about what was really going on in the firm. That was a great phone call, and we had a follow-up phone call, and I was intrigued. I was interested to hear about the firm and their path towards continued growth. So we had a couple of phone calls. That was great. And again, I took the first phone call really as a professional courtesy. Maybe I could refer somebody. But the more I learned about the firm and the leaders in the firm and where they wanted to go, it became more and more interesting because they had this really great balance of phenomenal portfolio, amazing group of clients, but they weren't resting on their laurels. They wanted to keep going. And, 33 years is an interesting spot to be in for a business because you certainly have maturity, but it also still has a sense of youth and ambition and scrappiness, to keep going and to keep growing. It hasn't quite ossified as an institution yet, which is great, right? It continues to evolve. So it intrigued me. The more I learned, the more interested I became. And then the conversation slowly started to tip with, maybe I can refer to someone as, I wonder if I have the skills that might be of benefit to the firm.
Super powerful. And one major takeaway I have is on the recruiting front, because when people talk about recruiting C-level, director level, higher level leaders within a company, it's oftentimes it's a slower process. There's more moving parts, and we really want to make sure that we nail things the first time around. So it sounds like they took such a solid approach with you, understanding that the first call with you is a completely exploratory career call. If nothing else, you'll be able to point them in the right direction. So that means their internal team was willing to network with the right leaders that could link them to the right person potentially, which means they are really bought into recruitment if they're willing to have those type of exploratory calls from my perspective, because oftentimes I've seen companies shut those down. If they're not interested in the position, they're not interested in speaking, if that makes sense. But
Right.
not only did they have the exploratory call with you, but they knew they probably weren't going to be able to land you. That was most likely their mentality going into this. They still explored with you. They were patient enough to meet you where you were at. And it just so happened that ended up attracting you to the firm at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like the way you phrase it, exploratory calls. And we can talk about it, but there were a lot of conversations. So it might have been the first 2 or 3 calls were exploratory calls. And what I found over a lot of years of recruiting and hiring, just in the nature of being in studio and firm management, you plug in a lot on the recruiting and hiring front, is there's the exploratory call or just getting to know you or maintaining a good relationship is great for everybody involved. If a candidate declines the offer or you don't get to the offer stage, but everybody's treating each other with mutual respect, courtesy, let's stay in touch, I think the larger ecosystem benefits. And we've seen people who maybe chose another opportunity, which is great. It made the best sense for them, but they ended up coming back and they said, that choice I made didn't quite work out, but I was really interested in what you had to offer. Can we talk again? Or fast forward a few years down the line and that candidate has gained a little bit more experience or has a different perspective and a different position opens up and you've already established a relationship and a rapport. So I think any opportunity you have to have a conversation with someone is always a good opportunity.
That's an interesting point you bring up about someone leaving as well and coming back. It's actually happened at companies I've been at where people were offered, for example, in my first sales job, they were offered another sales position for another window company. For example, let's just say it was Renewal Anderson. There's a great opportunity with Renewal. I'm with CDW. They come in, they want to poach our people. And then the founder of the company, and literally the founder and the president of the company, would talk to people about this. If they were a valued rep and they wanted to keep them on the team, they would say, hey, I actually want you to be able to explore your career. I want you to be able to see what's out there, get a taste of what's available. You won't know until you know. But just know this, I will give you essentially a one-time, I will give you the opportunity to come back to CDW if you find that it actually was indeed best for your career. And what they find is after someone comes back once, it's very rare that they leave again, or at least it's a lot more rare that they leave again because they already tried is the grass greener, and they found out that the grass wasn't greener in that situation. So they come back, and then there's a lot more trust built. There's a lot more mutual understanding of the value of the opportunity, the value of the culture that they're providing as a company to the employee. And I'm also curious about this. This is something that I haven't talked about a lot, but it's something I've talked about behind the scenes with clients a lot, which is what happens if someone leaves twice? Say someone leaves once, that's understandable. Let's say they come back and they leave again. What's your I guess, general policy about someone who leaves twice?
It's an interesting question. I can't talk about a general policy. I'm sure some organizations have policies. If someone leaves, here's the rule. I would want to understand, the individual, their reasons for leaving both times, and their potential contributions to the firm and the relationships they have with the firm. There's so many different stories about, professional growth and ambition and what's going on in their personal lives, or it could be their career, but, sometimes you have people who leave a firm because someone in their family is taking a job somewhere else or something else changes in their personal life. So I wouldn't, on the one hand, I wouldn't rule them out. I know that some cultures and organizations are like, no, if you've left, you've left. And if that works for them, fine. But I'd like to understand a little bit more. I would just balance that with, the saying is, once is an anomaly, twice is a coincidence, three times is a pattern, right? So when you get to that twice point, you're like, okay, kind of a coincidence, what's going on here? But you'd prefer it not be a pattern. And then also, I try to look at things in the context of what's best for the organization and what's best for the clients. Well, in this case, what's best for the individual, right? People should make the decision that's the most appropriate for where they are in their career and in their lives. But whether or not they'd be invited back, there's that question of, is this a good move for our clients? Is this a good move for our organization? And if the answer is yes, I think it should be considered. I wouldn't get too stubborn and dogmatic just because someone has left twice, depending on the circumstances.
I really appreciate that response because it seems that you're removing a lot of emotion, a lot of knee-jerk reaction, and you're saying, let me get to the bottom of this. Let me see what's really going on with the situation, because in reality, every situation is not the same. One candidate might leave for a completely separate reason. The example you gave of someone leaving for family is a very reasonable situation that can happen in life. But like you said, it goes back to, will they contribute to the firm if they come back? Were they a great part of our culture? What do I foresee the future looking like? Kind of like reviewing past events and why they left, and what could that future look like for everyone together? That definitely makes sense. And sort of to kind of go further on what we were talking about earlier, because you hit a really solid point about your interview process. And companies want to know across the board, how can I make sure we do thorough due diligence in the process to where turnover doesn't happen? The one thing people don't love in recruiting, well, I should say one thing, is when people turn over. You hire someone, you have a good feeling, but a couple stones weren't unturned, or you didn't find out X, Y, or Z, or maybe something was misrepresented, and it ends up being a mishire. And then for one reason or another, the candidate ends up leaving the company. So you mentioned a really thorough process, and you also mentioned not only the company got to know you very well, but you got to know the company very well. Would you mind telling me just a little bit more about the courting process and how they got everyone so comfortable with each other?
Yeah, it was pretty in depth, and it went on for a long time. And you're constantly balancing this in terms of, let's say, professional integrity and ethics, right? Because you can be talking to one organization, but in my opinion, you have to still maintain 100% confidence and 100% confidentiality in the organization that you're currently representing, right? So there's always that balance there, and I think there should never be questions of integrity, personal and professional integrity. So have to maintain that. But in the process, let me see if I can remember. There were probably maybe 3 one-on-one exploratory phone calls. That led to a video conference with maybe 7 or 8 of the principals and the shareholders of the firm. Following that was a video conference with 7 or 8 at the director level, so some of whom would be direct reports, and a few wouldn't necessarily be direct reports, but we would end up working together, right? So you're starting to approach 360. Then from there, and each step along the way, there was a debrief, one-on-one phone call, which was, what did you think? Do you want to keep the conversation going? And those questions went in both directions, right? Did they feel comfortable with the sorts of things I was saying? Was I comfortable with what I was learning about the firm? Following that, there was a in-person interview with, I think, 9 or 10 of the principals, most of whom are shareholders. And that was particularly interesting. One, it's always great to spend time in person. It was also interesting, when you have a Zoom call, everyone gets a box and there's a certain equal distribution. If you're having an interview with 9 or 10 people, sure, everyone takes up physically the same amount of space in the room, but it's a very different conversation, right? Because you're sort of turning around the table and you're talking to different people, and you're both trying to respond to individuals, but also making sure that you're addressing the whole group. So that was really fun, and you just pick up on a lot of things when you're in person about expressions and nonverbal cues and body language. So that was great. And at each step along the way, I was learning things about the business and the organization and their practice of architecture. But for me, what was also really important is I was getting a sense of how the MBH culture communicates with outsiders, because at that point I was an outsider, and then how the individuals communicate and what sorts of things were important. And I have to say, I just kept on having this vibe after each conversation by thinking, like, that's a great firm, and wow, those are really nice people. And I wasn't necessarily looking for those are nice people, but it kept on resonating with me. And you think we spend a lot of our waking hours with our professional colleagues, and you hope that they embody things that you find important. So nice people, that was important to me. So after that in-person conversation, I had tossed out the idea of something like, I'd love to have a follow-up. Anyone wants to have a cup of coffee one-on-one, or a smaller group, or go for a hike? And I just sort of tossed it out there because I like to walk in the woods. I like to go for a hike. And they said, oh, well, Oliver Mello's chief financial officer, Ollie's, a big outdoors person. He goes for hikes all the time. Why don't you two go for a hike? And we both kind of were like, okay, that sounds fun. And so we ended up meeting at a regional park, and we hiked for about 3 hours on the trail. And that was amazing. It was great because then you're starting to get to know the person, not necessarily, their functional title representing the organization. And we talked a lot about work, about the firm, about my experience, about his experience, where the firm was going. But we're also just 2 people hiking. And you just learn a little bit more about the person. From there was a one-on-one with the founding principal, John McNulty, an amazing person, just a really great person, and a very accomplished professional. The way he has grown and nurtured the team here, it's a indication of true leadership. So that conversation was great, and we talked about everything from allocation of assets to Robert Johnson and the Delta Blues. So it was just a fun conversation. Following that, I had another, a one-on-one after dinner with one of the principals who wasn't able to attend the in-person. And that was supposed to be a quick, let's just chat for about an hour. And then 3 hours later, we're sort of looking at the clock going, we should probably take off, get back to our families. And then from there, then we started moving into more of a closing mode. So I don't know, that was probably 7 or 8, maybe more individual or specific conversations with different scales of groups. It was pretty rigorous. It was pretty thorough. I tried to be as candid and honest as possible. I think candidates have the responsibility. to be as transparent as possible. No one's expecting a candidate to be perfect, and you want people to understand what, where you have opportunities for growth as well as your strengths. So I tried to be as straightforward as possible and as candid as possible. And I think the fact that we had a lot of conversations meant that the initial professional ceremonial courtesies could be done away with. I mean, of course, you have to have them, but then you can just start to have real, honest conversations, which is critical, because if you're going to work with people and make a long-term commitment, you want to have a sense of, how things really work and what's really important to the individual and to the culture.
So much insight just in that 4 or so minute clip. But one major takeaway I had was the approach that you both took on transparency to make sure that everyone was on the same page. But more than that, I think what was so important is how you said you felt from every conversation that you walked away with the vibe of the type of people they were. But not only that, from our conversation, you showed up to work and there's still these type of people. It's still the same type of culture they represented during the hiring process. And something I find oftentimes is people will write how great their team family culture is on their website and how warm their culture is. But when they start communicating with candidates, they don't communicate warmly. They're very brash. They take a long time to respond. They will ice a candidate after an interview where they had a good interview. Maybe it makes sense to say, hey, things didn't work out. My point is, building goodwill in the market is very important one way or another. And how you do something, I believe, is oftentimes how you do everything. So if you're not going to be warm and bubbly during, the actual work life, then maybe it makes sense to not tell people you have a very warm, family-oriented culture. Or if your team is a work hard culture, respect. There are a good amount of work hard cultures in the construction industry. Don't tell your employee that they're going to show up and they're going to work from 9 to 5 and that's the expected, day to day, right? I actually think we talked about something like this. How important, Jason, do you think transparency is from both sides in the hiring process?
I'm glad you brought it up, Matt. I think transparency is really important. And it's similar, we had talked about, this idea of radical transparency or radical candor. I think it's really important. My opinion is that it does take a certain amount of emotional maturity. Are you comfortable in your own skin, revealing things where they might be some of your weaknesses, or are you comfortable hearing hopefully constructive, but constructive critical feedback about either how you're doing, either in your work or maybe along a interview process. But so as long as everybody's has the maturity to deal with it professionally and process it in a healthy way, I think it's really important, because you're investing together. You're investing your time. You're investing a chunk of your career, if not a huge proportion of your career. So I think the more that people know about what's going on, the better everyone will be in a position to make a good decision, whatever that decision is. So I think the transparency is very, very important. But that also takes trust and rapport. And that's where I think having a lot of conversations helps, because you build up the trust, you build up the rapport, and you're able to peel back layers of social niceties so you can just have an honest conversation.
Mm-hmm. What I'm curious about is, are there any actual tactics or strategies that you've ever used or seen used in the interview process to elicit that level of trust? Something, just to give you an example, maybe this will spark something, maybe not. Something I do with my candidates is I like to tell them just off the bat, this is a situation where if I have a position that I'd like to, or that I'm explaining to them, first, they need to know that I'm not pitching them on a position. My goal with any call is to have an exploratory career call to learn about where they're at, where they've been, their experience, their goals, and their aspirations in this industry, where they want to see themselves in the next 3 to 5 years. And I want to see if my opportunity can help align them with that. And if not, I don't want them to even understand the opportunity. I won't even pitch them the opportunity because it's not a fit for their career. And I just know that. So I tell people up front, hey, look, I'm not going to send you opportunities that I don't think are a fit. I'm not going to waste your time with something just to make a placement. But on the flip side, I ask you that you are completely transparent with me. We have a two-way street of honesty, because in recruitment, if a candidate is misrepresented by me, that's a look on me. And I can't represent candidates who misrepresent themselves. So as long as we can keep complete, honest transparency with each other throughout the process, this will be a smooth, within reason process. Although recruiting's never easy, the goal is just to make sure it's transparent and everyone's on the same page. But have you ever seen anything work to elicit that trust?
It's one of those hard things, right? Like, it when you see it, I don't know. I don't know if if there's a 7 point checklist to elicit trust. So let's see. Um, like I would say along the process of just the initial communication, straightforward follow up, be clear about what's going on. If you can have a few different conversations, right? Because then you can build up rapport. But sometimes you just have that initial conversation. Um, to a certain extent, I think there's value in being honest about what's going on. If you're the interviewer, being honest about what's going on in your company. Sometimes you have an opening because someone left, and you might want to explain without disclosing, personal circumstances. You might want to disclose like, we've got a high intensity client here, and it can add to a lot of pressure on the team, and this person chose to focus on a different aspect of their career right now. That's why they left, but we wanted you to know that, right? It's a great client, it's a great environment, but it's kind of intense, and if that's not where you are right now, you should consider that. Or if that's where you thrive, you should consider that. So I think being honest about what's really going on in the organization and in the firm and with the position, I think that helps because you're showing that you're being honest, and then hopefully that elicits trust. And then the person sitting on the other side of the table might be more willing to share, what's going on with them. And that could mean, bragging about something that they would have otherwise been too humble to bring up, right? So it's, the honesty doesn't have to be negative, right? It could be positive. So I think that's really important. I often, not always, if I feel like an interview is going well and the conversation is healthy and you feel like you're getting some kind of connection, I typically wait until towards the end of the interview. I want to develop the rapport as much as possible, and then I will ask a question, which is basically, so do you want to ask the question that you're being too polite to ask right now? Like, what's the question that you really want the answer to, but you're afraid to ask? And if you've got good rapport, people will sometimes look super relieved and they'll be like, oh, well, and then, they'll ask a question about what's important to them, but they didn't want to bring up. So some people will ask about compensation, right? It might be rude or strategically they don't want to get in that conversation. It's like, no, people need to get paid. Ask your question. We'll give you an honest answer. Some people want, questions about work-life balance or internal stress load or stress load of the team. People will ask, realistically, are they really 9 to 5? Is that really what's going on? So I think even just offering that you're willing to ask, or that you're willing to answer an uncomfortable question, hopefully elicits some trust. And you learn a lot about the candidate as well, because you hear what's on their mind, and it's not always about money. It's about a lot of different things. And then some people will often say like, thanks, you've actually answered all my questions already. Some people are like, no, I'm not going to ask that question.
Right. Yeah, it makes total sense. And a couple other things that come to mind, just in case someone's listening wants to do some fact checking, or they're less comfortable interviewing, or they don't trust their gut as much. A couple other things you can do are just take notes in your interviews, just understand what they're telling you about their situation, and just cross-reference that to a resume. Just make sure that things line up. There aren't huge gaps in what they say and what their resume says and timelines and stuff. And you can also just talk to people who they worked with in the past as a reference check. That can be super valuable, because if they've done solid work in the past and they have advocates who believe in them, they should be oftentimes really excited to share a reference, right? Like, of course, I'm happy to share references. I have a list of X, Y, and Z. They're all people who are happy to speak to my experience, and I had a great time working with them. So this is just a couple things. Now, some people go much more in depth with the reference checks. Some people are like, hey, I trust my gut so much on this person, I don't even need a reference check. I'm good to go. I just heard someone say that yesterday. Oh, I knew this person was the one, so I didn't even call references. Okay, that's great. But these are just different levels and layers that you can apply to different situations to help through the interview process if you're ever finding yourself really wanting to double check things, make sure things are solid. But something that you actually mentioned was the involvement of the team, and how you would have these meetings with 7 to 8 people on the team. There was a lot of involvement, and it's specifically involvement for people who you would be working with directly. And
Mhm.
something I've noticed is some of the most successful teams I work with who have the most stickiness in their hiring process, they lay it all out. They bring, for example, if they're doing a construction project job, they're going to bring the PM out to the job to visit the site with another lead PM on the team. Another example, I just talked to someone yesterday who's backfilling a director of constructor position, a director of construction position. The reason they're backfilling is because two things. The last person was not a culture fit, so unfortunately there was a clash of personality. And also they said they had estimating experience that they really didn't have as much estimating experience with. So
Yeah.
I found out in their process that they did not take them on site during the interview process, and they did not actually take them to do a walkthrough and get a feel for how they approach things, how they analyze situations on a site, just as an example. And I
Mhm.
suggested they actually do this sort of workforce interview the next time around to get a feel and maybe bring someone, a lead estimator, out with them to get a feel for really what their chops are. And they were like kind of like blown away, like, oh my God, that's such a great idea. But I think the more companies who implement these types of like, I guess, stress test or like proof of concept interviews,
Yes.
it'll eliminate a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, absolutely. You're making an investment. You're investing your time. You're investing a lot of resources. You're potentially going to have, hopefully positive, but you're going to have an impact on the other people in your organization. You're potentially bringing in bringing in someone in your organization that will be client facing, right? So now you're investing in your reputation, right? Because that person's representing you. So, it doesn't matter how busy you are. If you don't have the time to be thorough, you don't have the time to not be thorough. I mean, you have to go as deep as possible to understand about the candidate to make sure that it's a good long-term fit for your needs. It's interesting you bring up references. There always seems to be a conversation. I strongly advocate you always have to check with references. But there's always that question is, well, no one's going to give you a reference that isn't going to say great things about them. So how do you approach that in terms of not the credibility of the reference, but maybe say the weight you would give to the reference?
Hmm. That's a really great question. For me, I want to find the people who are closest to the work we're looking to confirm, where they had similar roles and responsibilities on a somewhat of a similar team. That's my goal. Is I'm going to go as close to what I'm looking for as possible to speak directly to the experience that I learned that they have, to just confirm that experience, to make sure that the person who oversaw and who was a leader on the job does that. But I'd be curious to hear your insight as well.
I yeah, I think that idea of like as close to the job as possible, right? Because you're looking, the whole process is can this candidate deliver the goods or services that we deliver to our clients? Can they do the job, right? Not are they nice? Do they like the same music as I do? And that's all helpful, right? Can they do the job effectively? So the idea of talking to someone as close as possible to the responsibilities, that makes a lot of sense. I think the references are important. I don't know if you can quite quantify everything, but I'm looking for cues and clues, right? Sometimes if you talk to someone and they'd say, sure, I worked with your candidate and I can confirm that they worked from this date to that date, but our company policy is that we don't disclose anything else. That's a pretty good indicator because even if the company policy isn't that they don't disclose anything, you can pick up quite a bit from how they even communicate that simple communication or that simple information. That doesn't mean you should make a huge bet on that. It's still limited information, but it can still inform your thought process. And then you have other people where they'll be very straightforward, and you can ask things like, how does the candidate work in a stressful situation? Right? It's not so much can they do the day to day, but how do they work when things get a little bit intense? Or how were they in terms of their relationships with their colleagues? So it's not so much do they know that program or have they done that estimating task, 10 times so that they've developed some sense of how it really goes, but how do they fit into the culture? What's their interpersonal dynamic? And you can pick up some of that information. I think that's important. Even if someone's giving a glowing reference, you can still glean a lot of important information about the candidate in addition to, oh, they're great, I would hire them.
Mm. And something else, great, amazing points. Something else I do to make sure that they're actually on the same page as my client, because every culture is different, every company's needs are different, is I want to ask my client, what are the questions that you want answered from not only the candidate, but also I will go back and double check with the reference to make sure they not only align with, yes, the experience, they can do the job, but are they a culture fit? Do they have that culture fitness? And so we can ask targeted, pointed questions that specifically relate from your style of culture to the, the type of candidate and the experience this reference check had with the candidate, to really help confirm, do you think this person would fit in this type of culture? Do you think it would be somewhere where they'd thrive? Do you see any issues? And also finding ways to learn how leadership can support this person in their new role, I think is really valuable going in. Because if nothing else, I can give my client a roadmap for how to best coach this person, what the best ways to teach them and work with them are, so they at least know that going in. But yeah, there's really a lot you can take from a reference check. It's definitely much more than, can they do the job? Have they done XYZ before in their past? I believe it should be a lot more than that, because that's not the only thing that reflects stickiness. That's not the only thing that reflects an overall good fit.
Yeah. To that, I would add, when you're getting a sense of what's the best way to coach the candidate or mentor the candidate, or other things that you're learning about the candidate from the reference, is candidates should be aware that there's also informal reference checking going on. Most industries are pretty small, and a lot of people used to work together at that other firm, or they crossed paths on this job where someone was a subcontractor and the other person was the prime. So a lot of people know each other. And even if you don't put someone down as a reference, if they see that you used to work at a firm where someone else has a contact, that person may get a call, right? And it's informal. And I think everybody should be aware of it. Number one, if you're checking on a reference and going through an informal network, you have to respect the candidate, because you don't want to disclose that they might be looking. I think you have to be really careful about that. So show some discretion on your part. And I think it even goes back to when you were giving the example of the window company, when one of the great team members left but then came back. When someone leaves your company, treat them well. Wish them well, wish them all the best. Do whatever you can to make that exit process as positive as possible. One, it's just a decent thing to do for humans. They were part of your team. Whatever reason they're leaving, make it a positive experience when they're leaving. And then also, when you're a candidate, when you leave, make sure your responsibilities are buttoned up as good as possible. Be courteous, be friendly, show appreciation. Even if you're leaving, because you want to, move on to something else, leave on the best terms possible. Again, it's the right thing to do, right? Just be a decent human, but also you never know that down the line, someone's going to call that company informally, right? And ask for a reference check. And you want them to be able to say, that person had a lot of class. That person really treated us with respect. We knew why they were leaving, and we understood why they were leaving, but boy, they left on really good terms, and we'd love to have them back. Or if you're thinking about hiring, and we strongly recommend you consider it, because, they showed such professionalism and integrity on their way out. So yeah, that informal network is really important. And I'm always surprised that people don't realize that it's happening.
Yeah, for me, it goes back to how you do one thing is how you do everything to an extent in life. It's like you might think that one or two people who you really impressed intentionally on your best day are the ones who are going to be your reference. But at the end of the day, the people who were around you on your worst day might actually be your reference, and you might not even know it. So it's really just stay on top of the ball, stay sharp. And even if you don't feel good, stay up for your team, stay up for the people around you. Because if it's not for you, do it for the people around you. This is a team sport in business. It's not an individual sport. So the team feels that.
Yeah, absolutely. Perform for the benefit of the team, whether it's your first day or your last day. And then the people who are around you on your worst day, I don't know. I mean, on your worst day, that probably reflects as much of who you really are as on your best day, right? So, there's no expectation that you have to be perfect, but the people who are around you in the most stressful situation probably have a good sense of, how you handled that, and how well you did and how well you performed when things were really hard. And that's also probably where you develop some very strong relationships as well.
Definitely. And this goes for recruiting too. There's so many ups and downs in recruiting. One day a candidate could, say they're accepting an offer. The next day they ghost you and you never hear from them again. It's like, how do you handle yourself in situations where some people might argue it's easy to be unprofessional or to react emotionally to a situation, or, just to do something that isn't in the best interest of other people just because you didn't get your way, just as an example. There are so many things that just being emotionally mature, like you talked about earlier, and emotionally intelligent, just being in tune with yourself, just take a deep breath sometimes and just realize that the next thing you could do could be what is on your reference check that stops you from getting that job. At the end of the day, that is the reality of the situation.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Yeah, I think you're spot on. Yes.
and kind of just a little quick segue for me, I like spotlighting like what people are most proud of in their career. For you, over your career, what would you highlight as your most proud accomplishment, or the most proud thing that you've been able to do over your career?
It's an interesting question. Two things come to mind, and I would say they're both actually pride of association more than pride of accomplishment. So it's not something necessarily that I did, but I was really proud to be associated with the people who were able to pull this off. Professionally, I worked with two very talented project managers, senior project managers, both very established and experienced architects. And they were responsible for a group of, I don't know, maybe 18 or 20 design professionals working on institutional projects. So colleges, universities, higher education, as well as healthcare projects and hospitals. And so different programs, but similar client types because they're institutional. And they were both individually strong performers, and together as partners leading this group, they were particularly effective. And they had really gotten to their point in their career, let's say within the past year or so, where they had gone from being incredibly strong individual contributors managing their projects, and now they were managing this large team and a portfolio of projects in addition to their projects. So they were growing into this next phase of leadership. And it was, I don't know, this is the beginning of Q4, it's towards the end of the year. And I asked them to send me their goals for their group for the following year, and that I wanted to work with them on that. And they sent me their goals and how they were planning on achieving their goals. And over the course of the fourth quarter, we sat down and talked a lot about refining their goals, refining their plans to achieve those goals. And even just in the process of refining the plan, sometimes you have to modify the goal itself. It's an iterative process. Your first pass at writing down a milestone or a goal or an ambition is just that. It's the first pass. You think of it as something that could be refined and developed. And so we spent a lot of time really working out the game plan for what that following year would be. And they were very open to it. And to be clear, they came up with the goals, they came up with the techniques, and I was there to help stress test the ideas and to make sure that they were clearly articulating what was actually important, not just what they thought I wanted to hear or what they thought someone up in the corporate level wanted to hear, but what was really going to serve the clients and serve the organization. And then I made sure that they were communicating effectively with their team, right? Because the team had to buy in on these goals, and making sure that the frequency of the metrics were appropriate for how they were going to deliver. So we spent a lot of time doing this. And again, they were doing the work and it was their team. I was just there to help them think it through critically and thoroughly. And during that following year, starting from January 1, day one, go, execute, they were amazing. As leaders, as managers, the whole team, what they delivered. By the time we got to wrapping up that year, they outperformed every other group in our organization, in terms of revenue generation and profit. And I would say even more importantly, in terms of morale and team culture and team cohesion. I mean, these two individuals, they were just amazing, and they were great people. And I enjoyed working with them every step along the way. And again, to be clear, they did the work. I didn't do the work. And subsequently, in that next round of promotions, they were both recognized with serious career milestones, and they were invited to a seat at the table where executive level decisions were being made. So major career advancement, major recognition for what they had contributed. And then fast forward another 6 months, one ends up being responsible for operations for that whole organization, the whole regional office, which is about 4X responsibilities compared to what she had been doing, and she's crushing it. I was talking to another colleague just the other day, and they said she's crushing it. She's doing amazing. And the other person in that partnership, he is now the West Coast regional leader for all higher education. So again, they had sort of two major career milestone bumps because they delivered. So they were doing the work. They were on the field executing the plays and scoring. I was just on their team on the sidelines cheering them on. But that's definitely something that came to mind, is just to be associated with people who are doing great things creates a lot of pride. And yeah, they're great, great people, and they really take care of their teams. And then I would say maybe the second, and again, it's pride of accomplishment. I didn't do the work. It's a little bit more personal, but I think I apply the lessons every day in my professional life. It's our daughter. She's in her early 20s, super nice person. And just like everybody else, just like you, just like me, she's had setbacks. She's been knocked down. But what I've noticed, and this probably started, I don't know, when she's maybe middle school years, she'd get knocked down and it would hurt. It would be uncomfortable. She wouldn't be happy about it. And she's human like everybody else. But more than most people, pick herself up, dust herself off, run right back at that same challenge. And she could get knocked down multiple times. Pick herself up, dust herself off, run back at the challenge. And eventually she would break through and she would get to where she wanted to go. And I would see her apply this, in athletics. She plays ultimate frisbee, in her personal life, in her academic life. And she has been able to go to places that, she probably would have never thought she would have been able to pull off, just because she's developed this incredible resilience. And she's taken basically all of her struggles and she's converted them into this amazing internal strength. And I know it's an amazing lesson, like I said, that I try and apply in my professional life. And I didn't do the work, she did the work, but it's pride of association since she's our kid.
Yeah, it kind of sounds to me like you take the mentality of, for example, like a Phil Jackson, a great basketball coach, someone who takes pride in building up others. And that's so powerful to me, because some of the best leaders I've had, they got to where they are because they weren't just concerned about their own well-being. They were concerned about, how can I also help others achieve their best potential? And a quote I heard that stands out so much is, the best leaders are the people who help people achieve things that they didn't even know were possible, right? So you're empowering people to do these things. And as a dad, I'm sure your daughter got it from somewhere. She probably just wasn't born with this intrinsic, mentality about how to approach life. There had to be something from the parents in there, but that's not your mentality. You're not taking accountability. You're saying, my team did this. I helped them. I was there to nurture them, but in reality, they did this. Like your daughter, your team at work, your team, like whatever team we're talking about, you're just giving back to the team. And you have such a selfless perspective on what accomplishment even means, which is what I think is one really cool takeaway from this.
Yeah, thanks. And I really like, Matt, the way you emphasize team. Our professional lives, it's not athletics. Literally, it's not athletics. But I think there's a lot about athletics, especially, at the recreational level or the competitive level, that we can apply on lessons learned. You're an athlete, you're a competitive athlete, and played at a high level for a lot of years. And yeah, it's about the team, because it's the team wins. Even individual sports, typically you're still some part of some kind of larger team. So you must have had that experience playing at a very high level where, the person who was all about themselves may not have been the right fit, whereas the person who was promoting the team is the person that really kind of drove things forward. I assume you've run into that multiple times.
100%. And I've learned so much being on both sides. When I was younger in my career, I realized, like, hey, I'm being selfish right now. I'm not doing what's best for the team. I'm doing what's best for me. I had to be real with myself and say, I'm not the person who, as a teammate, I want to be right now. And so I learned so much along the way that actually helped me become better. And I try to do the same thing as a leader. I'm consistently checking myself. Am I doing the things that I'm talking about doing? Am I holding true to my word with my team? Like, for me, those things are so important. And it's just what I learned in baseball was the things that were most important. Did my coaches practice what they preach? Did they hold us accountable? Were they consistent? Like, those were the coaches I was most bought into. So, It's I've learned so much from sports, but 100%, I've believe they've improved me in terms of how I can be a good team member.
Yeah. And it's not just sports. I think sports are a great analogy, and if you can directly apply, like you've been able to, that is important. But it could be music. People who play in different musical groups and bands. Could be clubs. It could be some kind of religious organization, but where you feel like you're part of a larger group trying to make something happen. And it doesn't mean you have to join every group. And there's lots of great individual contributors. But I think as long as you realize that it's not all about you, it's hopefully for something bigger.
Another example that comes to mind just in sports, some people might who watch the UFC, the United Fighting Championship, I think is what it stands for. And basically there's one fighter in the ring. It's like their team is one person, but their team is not one person. They have a nutritional coach, they have a gym coach, they have a striking coach, all these different coaches. And the athlete gives it up for their team oftentimes when they win a championship. I wouldn't have been able to do it without my coaches. I wouldn't have been able to do it without my wife and kids, who have supported me along the way. It's like giving it back to all those people and realizing in reality, yeah, you did it yourself, sure, if you want to have that mentality, but you didn't really. There were so many people who supported your success and who are rooting for you and supporting you. So yeah, the team mentality, I think, is just so important that you're right. It's not just sports. Team applies to so many things in life. It just so happens that I come from sports, so it's like a frame I use a lot. But no, it definitely, sports is not the only team game in the world. And kind of just a quick transition on hiring, right? So let's just say I'm an AEC firm. I want to hire a COO. I really want to land someone. I want to nail the hire, right? I want to make sure I get it right the first time, bring in someone who's a rock star, fits the culture. Would you give any just high level insights on how to get that done?
If you're hiring a COO, you have to recognize there's typically only one COO, right? So it's not like you can have your three other COOs interview and say, well, this is how we do it. So you're looking for certain traits, abilities, skill sets, sensibilities, attitudes that will make the person successful or at least contribute to their success. Obviously, you need the cultural fit. So, and that's really, some of these thoughts, maybe they could apply really to any position in the company. But especially as you bring someone in who's going to have that much accountability and responsibility and influence, they become that much more important. So there's the cultural fit. Have as many conversations in as many different environments as possible, just so you can get a sense of how it's going to work. Specifically for an operations person and at the executive level, I think the operations person, in my opinion, to be successful has to have a handful of different traits. They have to be comfortable synthesizing a lot of information, right? Because if you're in operations, businesses don't exist for operations, they exist for something else, right? So if you're in operations, you're constantly working with the people who are delivering the goods or the services. That's the reason for being for the business, right? So it's professional services if you're in architecture, engineering, or law or accounting firm. It could be construction. It could be the physical a building project. If you're in manufacturing, it's the product. So you have to work with the people who are delivering the goods and services. You work with legal, you work with finance, you work with marketing, you work with human resources, you work with business development and sales, and you work with facilities. And that's just internally. And then oftentimes you might be working with outside counsel and outside accountants and outside PR agencies. So you're working with a lot of different people. So someone who's able to synthesize a lot of information. You have to have someone who's willing to be a diplomat in the most appropriate way, which means sometimes you have to be super flexible and sometimes you have to be firm, right? In operations, you're constantly allocating and reallocating resources, which means you're understanding where you need to provide additional resources for teams that are either stressed out or have a big workload coming up, or sometimes that means you're redistributing resources away from a group, and you have to make sure that they understand you're not taking away from them in a negative way. You're just redistributing based on where the current priorities are in the company or how it fits a larger mid or long-term strategy. So someone who's comfortable being a diplomat. We were having dinner with friends the other night, and this came up in the conversation. you have to be able to speak multiple languages to multiple people, right? You're dealing with so many different people, and not just personality types, but based on professional discipline. These are different languages. It might all sound like English or whatever the language of the company you're working for is. But I'll give you an example. So I had 3 back-to-back meetings a couple days ago. One was with the chief financial officer. So we were looking at month-to-date financials, we were looking at year-to-date financials, and we were doing revenue projections into 2023. And we were talking finance the whole time. Right after that, I ended up having a meeting with our design director. And we're in, like everybody else, trying to finalize business plans for the following year. So a lot of these conversations are around the same thing. So right after talking to the chief financial officer, I was talking to our design director. And we were talking about, how we should be establishing design goals, and that's particularly complex. One, how do you take an organization that's already performing at a very high level in terms of design, and say, how do we push this even further? That's complex. Moreover, design is really hard to quantify and to measure, but at the same time, we want to be able to say, how are we doing in progress towards the goal? So the conversation is somewhat philosophical about what's the nature of design and how do people contribute towards design, and how do we know if we're doing a good job? And then right after that, I had a conversation with our technical director, incredibly talented architect and super nice guy. And we were talking about how do we continue to incorporate a really rigorous quality control process into projects with a compressed schedule, right? So this is a kind of an interesting logic puzzle of something, quality control is critical and you can't ignore it, but it's very complex if a project is moving on at a really quick clip. So I bring up those 3 examples, chief financial officer, design director, technical director, because they're really 3 different languages, about 3 different things, but interesting because I'm the operations person. I'll be honest with you, Matt, they were all the exact same conversation for me. They were talking about the exact same thing in the sense that, how do we provide top-tier client service and deliver design excellence and maintain financial resilience for the firm? It just sounded very different in each of the 3 conversations. So a diplomat, someone who can speak multiple languages, and someone who is able to synthesize a lot of different information and disciplines. Does that help answer the question?
So detailed. Yeah, much appreciated. Was there any, is it pretty much from, just in case someone's watching and they're like, oh, that all sounds awesome. What is the best way to vet for this? Some people use personality tests. Some people do a very deep dive on history. Some people have very good guts and they can have a conversation with someone, and they can actually have a conversation with multiple people to see if they have that fluency in multiple languages, as you put it. Do you have any ways to sort of stress test like this during the interview process?
I don't know. There may be a good stress test in the interview process itself. Having someone, develop a case study for you. I haven't worked through that. So maybe there is. I would look at historic performance. So if they've been in an operations role before, dig deep, find out, what they were delivering on, what the results were, how it made sense for the company. And operations will vary from company to company to company, right? Because it's not all exactly the same. There's a big overlap, but some operations lean a little bit heavier on finance, some lean a little bit more on production, some lean a little bit more towards executive level strategy, some combination of that and more. But you can find out similar information if you have a very strong, someone who hasn't necessarily been in the role with a functional title operations, but let's say if they've managed multiple projects at the same time, they will be developing similar skill sets. And you can ask questions about team cohesion and culture and retention and financial performance and quality control and client satisfaction. So you can ask those questions for someone who's managed multiple projects, or someone who's managed one project, but it's big and complex with lots of stakeholders in it, lots of different sub-consultants and general contractor and subcontractor, or a client group that has lots of different people in it. So you're trying to answer this question and be responsive to this question. So hotels, hospitals, university buildings would be examples of big projects. So if you have someone who's successfully managing that scale of project, chances are they've developed some of the skill sets that'll help them be successful in operations. But, again, try and get as much historic data as possible. And then you have to be reasonable in how you extrapolate that going forward. Doesn't mean it will absolutely work out that way, but it's a good indicator. And, trying to find that balance, I'm sure you're dealing with this every day, is do you find the candidate who has the exact experience and skill sets needed, or do you find the candidate who has the skill sets and experience so that they're primed to grow into the role? And you probably having that conversation multiple times a day.
It actually is a topic that people differ on, I find. They often differ. For example, someone I'm doing a CFO search, a controller search for, was actually originally going to be a CFO search in the Bay Area. But what ended up happening was they've had a CFO in the position already for 20 years. They have a very streamlined, financial operations process, to my understanding. Not that I'm on their team as an accountant or anything, but from what I understand, it's very solid. They're not looking for a seasoned CFO to come in and change everything, to come in, change their processes, throw curveballs to what's already been working for 20 years. They actually want someone who's probably more on the lines of like a senior accountant or a young controller right now, who's going to be actually like a CFO in training for the next 3 to 5 years, who's going to be mentored by their existing CFO. They're going to bring them up to spec. They want someone who's humble, who's going to come in and really be like a sponge to learn process. And then once this person learns process, then we would appreciate the person to start making suggestions about improvements. I think you could do this here. I think you could do this here. But in the beginning, they want the person to really be a sponge and just understand their process and come in with a real understanding that they want a culture fit, and they want someone who's going to grow into the position of CFO over the next 3 to 5 years. So that's just an example I have of how you can kind of teeter-totter on, do I go with someone who has all the experience versus someone who maybe doesn't but has intangibles and the proof of success in the past that would lead us to believe they would be solid in this position. Like, they have the relevant skills and experience to some extent. Now, the question would be, if this client of mine didn't have really solid internal processes and this person wasn't there for 20 years that had built all this out, and they maybe felt like they were struggling and they were kind of on the fence, do I even feel good about my own processes in terms of delegating? Maybe they're just not as strong or streamlined there. Then it seems to me that the conversation would be more along the lines of, let's get someone in who's a seasoned vet who's already built out these processes for another company so they could do something for you, and they can come in with a higher level of experience in the space and more, I guess, domain expertise, if you will.
Yep.
But with that said, it is a fine line. And I think it really does depend on the company, their needs, and their vision for the position.
Yeah. Absolutely. I like the way you broke that down and said, there's different scenarios, and there are appropriate ways to handle each of the different scenarios.
Surely. So I guess this is something I really love shedding light on. Let's just say I'm a young AEC professional and I want to be in your shoes someday. What advice would you give me?
For a lot of early career professionals, you can get distracted by the shiny objects and you want to do what's cool or what your friends are doing, or where you think you're going to get a lot of glory. Or the other part that we hear quite a bit in architecture is, I don't want to be pigeonholed. I've already been doing this for 3 months. I already know it. And you're like, 3 months, that's not quite that long. I've done it once. I know it. And you're like, no, you've done it once, do it 100 times. Then you might know it. I was like that, and I was probably like that more so. So I know from experience. The advice I would give is go deep. And let me give you an example. A long time ago, my wife and I, we lived on a small island out in the Western Pacific. And on the north side of the island, you walk down to this area. It's called the Grotto, and it's sort of this big yawning maw of a cave. And the bottom is all seawater. Now, you're on the inland side of some cliffs. You can't see the ocean. You're inland. And what you do is you put on your scuba gear, you jump into the water, and you swim down about 60 feet. So swimming down 60 feet it's about the same as like stand on the roof of a 6-story apartment building, fill it with water, and now swim down to the front door. That's 60 feet. You swim down about 60 feet, and then there is a hole in the side of the rock wall. And then you swim horizontally through this hole, and it's cool because it's jagged. It's not a tunnel; it's a natural formation, and there's eels in there. It's pretty cool. and then you pop out on the other side and you're in blue ocean. Those cliffs keep dropping all the way down to the ocean floor. And you see turtles and you see all sorts of tropical fish, and you've got amazing sunshine filtering down through 60 feet of water. So it's this phenomenal blue ocean experience. And I bring that up as an example in that early career professionals, I strongly recommend go deep on something, really learn it. At MBH, it's described as you're learning it, then you're honing your skills, and then you're gaining mastery, right? So you have these three levels. And by going deep on something, whatever it is, it could be, it could be rendering or model making or detailing curtain walls or laying out floor plans for an office space, whatever that is, or you could be in welding or in recruiting or in framing. It doesn't matter. Go deep on something, and the benefits are huge for several reasons. One, you're going to learn something that's really valuable, and you're going to be able to contribute to your team and to your clients. So that's good, right? To be able to execute at a very high level is really important in anything that we do. The second reason is really interesting, and it's unexpected, which is when you become really good at something, even if you're earlier in your career, people know to go to you for something. When you become that go-to person, you're developing rapport and you're developing relationships, and people start to have confidence in you. They're going to come to you to do other things as well, not because of your subject matter expertise, but because they trust you to get good things done for them. So you're developing rapport. Your opportunities, ironically, because you went deep, your opportunities will start to become broad for that. And then I would say the third reason, which is interesting, is in that process, not only have you learned whatever it is that's specific, right, to your industry and to your discipline, you have learned how to master something. There's all sorts of techniques and approaches and attitudes that you will have picked up along the way on how to become really, really good at something. And then you can apply that to almost anything else you do and get better and better. So you can keep going down that path if that's what's exciting for you and motivates you and helps you get to where you want to go. Or you could redirect and go in a different direction. But now you have this skill set about mastery that you're taking with you that can apply to pretty much anywhere you want to go. So go deep to go broad.
That it's so close to the way I say it in my head is like go deep versus go wide, go deep versus go broad. The same exact idea. And it relates to so many things in life for me. Like just as recruiting, I could have been a recruiter for everyone. I could have been a recruiter for healthcare companies, tech companies who sell, healthcare tech. There's a million things you can recruit for in the world. The reason I wanted to be a construction and AEC niche recruiter is so I could get the best as I can at my craft, hone a niche, become the best I can for that niche and solve their specific problems versus trying to solve everybody's problem. And when I can do that, I can come to people like I did yesterday and say, hey, my clients who are very similar to you, who have seen turnover in a role like this, found they solved their problem when they were able to have a workspace interview and they bring a PM out to the job and they do X, Y, Z. I wouldn't be able to do that as well if I helped everybody. I would be able to help interview and vet candidates still, but I wouldn't be able to be as much of a consultant as I want to be in the process. So that is super gold right there from my perspective. At least I could say it's really helped me as well. Just that personal tidbit in my career. It's been super helpful just to go deep versus wide. That deep work is where the real gold is in my experience.
Oh, absolutely. And you learn things that are very unexpected. And big league talents, I think it's a perfect example. I'm sure lots of organizations get well-intentioned but unexpected or unsolicited inquiries, and you run into people all the time that are selling their services, and they should. That makes sense. When someone in the AEC world crosses paths with you, there's already established bond and trust and rapport because you're in that industry. You're not, there's nothing wrong with being a generalist, but I think there's a lot of value to being a specialist, right? So someone says, they operate in the AEC space. They understand the stresses that I'm dealing with. They understand what's going on in our markets. So I think it's really valuable to have that level of specialization. Otherwise, to a certain extent, you're competing as a commodity, and that's really hard.
Yeah. The commodity game's a difficult one to be in. It's similar to construction and AEC too. It's like, yeah, you're going to have someone who comes in and bids the job lower than you, who will say they'll do X, Y, Z for less. But at the end of the day, are they going to do as good of a job? Are they going? That's the real question. And construction, we ran into that all the time. When I first sold construction, it's like we'd run into bids where someone would do the job for half. But it's like, are they licensed, bonded, and insured? Do they have testimonials? Do you have proof of concept? Do they actually have good quality product and warranty? Have you looked into these things to sort of assess? That's just kind of my mentality about deep versus wide. Because when you go deep, you're really nailing all, like, more and more of the things that matter to the people you serve, because you're going deeper and you have a deeper understanding of the end consumer and what they really want.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. So in AEC and in construction, I believe there's a level of uneducation. There's a stigma around it. People often think that it's like swinging hammers and banging nails, and there aren't too many opportunities that people know of that they could be able to springboard their career in this industry. And I'm just curious for you, do you see it as an untapped opportunity in construction and AEC? And if so, would you mind just kind of sharing a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's absolutely an untapped opportunity. I would say first and foremost, you know, for someone on the outside, you should absolutely consider swinging a hammer or learning how to weld. Um, Totally important and honorable trades, and that level of craft and expertise is huge. So I think as a society and as a culture, we kind of have to get over that weird stigma or division between labor versus professional services. So huge respect to our colleagues out there in the trades. So I'd say consider that for a career path. Even if take a summer job, being a carpenter's assistant, just to learn and to understand. And you might find that that's a viable career path. So that would be number one. Consider that. In terms of other opportunities, I think there are huge opportunities in the construction industry for people who don't necessarily have trade skills. There's all sorts of things that are similar to any other business. There's sales and marketing and legal and accounting and operations and administration. And I think the opportunities are limitless. On top of that, when you start to fold in things like hardware and software, I didn't work directly, but I was working with some teams that were using a robotic system to lay out the framing outlines on a concrete slab, right? So people are incorporating hardware and software directly into the AEC, and they've been doing it for decades. I think we're just seeing it more and more now. And you see a lot of people using drones for a lot of things involved in construction and robotics and prefabricated assemblies. So I think the world is not only big to begin with, but when you start to overlay current technology and interests in technology, it becomes that much bigger. Then it grows another step because you're also dealing with the world of real estate, right? Building of real estate and land use and regulatory issues and real estate development. And are you buying and flipping? Are you buying and holding, and rental incomes and renovation? So I think the world is huge, and it is in need of people who really care about the built environment wherever you plug in. And if you're passionate about something, if you're passionate about tech, if you're passionate about analysis, if you're passionate about sales, if you're passionate about craft, I think there's space for you. As much as the world is changing, at some point, people are always going to live and work in the built environment, and we're going to need professionals who are willing to contribute kind of at the highest level to make really high quality buildings and cities and larger environments.
Mm. Yeah, such a great point. Even just off the bat, I've heard so many great leaders. For example, I interviewed someone named Kyle Mitchin, who's a senior PM at Leighton, Dave Burris, who's now a PX for years at Clark Construction. They speak of how they came from the trenches. They started, as we talked about, swinging hammers, banging nails. I think just the fact that there's a stigma around that being not a sexy job, I don't love that. I actually think there's a lot of fulfillment you can get from a job like that. You actually see what you physically built happen in the world. Like you're seeing the result of your work. And that alone, I think, is something so cool about being in the trenches. But there's a lot more to it. Working with your hands is something I actually enjoy. I came up enjoying that. So I think just that stigma alone, knowing that it actually isn't the worst thing, it's actually could be a great thing to have a career where you are physical, where there is a level of labor involved, and knowing that if you want to advance your career, if you choose to do that in construction, you start in the trenches. That's how some of the best leaders came up. You talked about it earlier. Most of the leaders I talk to who are very successful leaders, they understand the jobs of other people and the positions they're leading. They're able to lead with empathy because of that. So not only can it lead to career growth, but it's also a great place to hang your hat if you want to hang your hat on a physical labor type of work. And then the flip side is, I loved how you put that. That has to be a micro clip from our podcast, because if you are thinking about sales, ops, admin, there are so many different verticals within construction people don't think about, but they're available in the industry, and the industry is not going anywhere. It's growing. People are still going to live in houses and multifamily, and we're still going to need commercial buildings for the foreseeable future, unless something radical happens in many years to come from now. I can't see that happening at this point in time. So there's just so much opportunity out there, and hearing from leaders like you who have advanced through their career, who understand the value of that, and we can share that message with the community. It means a lot, because we need to solve this labor shortage, and we need to chip away at it one day at a time, in my opinion. And hearing from people like you who have built a successful career in this industry, it means the world.
Yeah, cool, great. Yeah, it's really important, and I think the work that you're doing on your podcast makes a big difference, because you give the opportunity not only for people inside the industry to learn more, people from outside the industry to gain insight, to say, oh, that's what happened. For your listeners who haven't heard it yet, I think your interview with Kyle is great. He breaks down aspects of project management in such a clear, concise, applicable way. That in itself, hugely valuable. And I think you can apply it directly if you're in the construction world. But his thoughts on project management, you could probably apply to pretty much any industry or endeavor out there as well.
Much appreciated. I'm sure Kyle will appreciate the kudos as well. Well, I'll tell you what, Jason, this has been an absolute pleasure. Like, this has been so insightful, amazing show to have you on. Really appreciate having you. Before we wrap things up, would you mind just kind of sharing any future plans you want to highlight? Anything coming up with the team, company that's exciting that you want to shine a light on?
Sure. MBH continues to be in growth mode. If you're interested in what's going on in the firm, you can check us out, mbharch.com, mbharch.com, and you can learn about some recent projects and some press. We've got one project, it's completed, but it's getting a lot of accolades and recognition. It's the Baker Bioengineering Lab at Berkeley. It's the conversion of the UC Berkeley Art Museum into a biotech engineering space. It's an amazing project, and the team did a phenomenal job. It was led by one of our studio directors, Ken Lideker. Just such a phenomenal design professional. So that one is worth checking out. That's built. We've got a fair amount of life science work on the boards, and we're really developing a lot of housing projects as well. MBH is known for a lot of retail work, and very, very strong portfolio there. But we've also got this really strong life sciences and housing portfolio, and that's cool to watch those aspects of the practice grow and thrive and get on equal footing with the more established legacy aspects of the practice. So I'd say keep an eye out for life sciences and the housing projects. And I'm trying to think what else is going on at MBH. We're getting ready for 2023. It's going to be a great year. We just opened up the 5th office in Bangalore, in India. The team in India is doing phenomenal work. Really great colleagues. I got to sit in a couple weeks ago on their reviews, and that in itself, this will be indicative of what's going on at MBH, is to listen to the managers give feedback about the teams was amazing, because you could see how much the managers cared about the teams and what great leaders they were. So Bangalore office, Mumbai office are doing amazing work, and I don't know. Just celebrated our 33rd anniversary, and looking forward to a few decades more at least.
That's awesome. Well, cheers to your success, your team's success, your success in the new position. It's always great to hear an executive or any person in the construction AEC industry transfer into a new role, have expectations align with reality, really enjoy where they're at. And so I'm super happy for you and your team and where you're at. I really appreciate you coming on the show. This has been really valuable. I'm pumped to get this out to our community. And yeah, like just want to cap this off and say I appreciate you. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Matt. That was great. Really enjoyed it. Thanks very much.